Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Patriarchs in our study of ancient history, a framework for the Bible. One of the questions that we asked at the outset was the question of when did Abraham live? And to do that, it's going to take a bit of study and looking at several passages. One of those is 1 Kings chapter 6, where it says, "Now it came about in the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the second month, he began to build the house of the Lord." So what we have in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, it says, Solomon's temple began to be built 480 years after the Exodus. That seems pretty cut and dried. We just count up 480 years back to whenever Solomon's temple was, to get back to the Exodus. Now we're still going to have to go back further than that to the time of Abraham. But already there is a problem. You see, the Septuagint, notice when I have those letters LXX, that's shorthand for the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. The Septuagint has a alternate reading here. Instead of 480 years, it says that it's 440 years. So that means if I'm taking the Hebrew Masoretic text, I've got 931 BC is the traditionally accepted date for the beginning of Solomon's temple. I go back 480 years, and I have the Exodus occurring around 1441 BC. Now, don't hold us to the exact year. Obviously, these are rounded off to the nearest year, either up or down. But around 1441 BC, or if I'm taking the Septuagint reading, it is 1401 BC. So again, within the space of a single generation, that would put me in the 1400s for the Exodus, the 15th century. I next turn to Exodus chapter 12 and verse 40. And this is the passage that reads, "Now the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years." Both the Septuagint as well as the Hebrew text both speak about 430 years. But here again, there's a slightly different reading in the Septuagint. The Hebrew says from the Exodus to the time when Israel first entered into Egypt. That would have been back in the days of Jacob. The Septuagint puts it from the Exodus from Egypt, but only going back to the entrance of the Israelites into Canaan, not into Egypt. See, that one little word changes everything. Are we talking about 430 years since Jacob and his descendants had come into Egypt, or are we talking at an earlier time, 430 years from the Exodus to when Abraham first came into the Promised Land? That makes a bit of a difference. Now, Josephus, he's a first century historian. He, in his histories, he gives us the Septuagint reading as though it is authoritative. The dates that he gives correspond to the Septuagint reading. By contrast, when we read the prophecy of Abraham that's given to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, where God says, "Your descendants will be aliens in a foreign land for 400 years." Well, that backs up instead the Masoretic reading, the Hebrew text. And likewise, in the same way, Acts chapter 7, verse 6, in the Sermon of Stephen, he also is telling the story, and he includes the dates, and when he does, he includes them in accordance with the Hebrew text, that is the Masoretic reading. Which is correct? I don't know. I lean toward the Hebrew text. Maybe someday in the future I will reverse my opinion, but so far, all along, I've leaned toward the Hebrew text. Seeing the Septuagint, well, sometimes when you translate, you mess things up, and maybe that was the case. Maybe that's entirely unfair. I don't know. Now, since we're talking about Abraham, though, we closed last time looking at Leonard Woolley's Ur, that is the Ur of the Chaldees that was uncovered and excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s. And we have Abraham leaving Ur of the Chaldees. We have Abraham leaving Ur of the Chaldees and going to Haran. Ur of the Chaldees, what was this city like? We noted last time that this was a renaissance of culture, literally a golden age. We have the Sumerian civilization developing the first, perhaps it's too small to call it empire, but a collection of city-states. And under Ur of the Chaldees, under the city of Ur, all of these city-states in southern Mesopotamia were united. We made mention of the ziggurats and these temple towers that were used for worship. And Joshua chapter 24 verse 2 tells us that Abraham and his father Terah, back when they were in Ur, they worshipped foreign gods. And then one day God comes and reveals himself, and Abraham leaves these high places to go to a new place that God is going to show him. There's a picture of the restored ziggurat at Ur in southern Mesopotamia. Another photo of the same. I have to mention that some scholars have wondered, given the fact that Abram's culture and the things that we read about Abram in the book of Genesis seems to reflect more of a northern Mesopotamia culture rather than the southern culture of Sumer. And it's because of that reason that some have wondered if there is another location, another Ur, that was in the northern part of Mesopotamia. After all, you can have two cities with the same name. For example, there's a London in England, and there's also a London, I understand, in the state of Ohio. Much smaller, I'm assured. Were there two Urs? Did Abram come from the northern Ur? Again, that's speculation, so we'll leave it as a question mark. We don't know. But he eventually comes to Haran. And here we have Terah with his three sons, Abram, Nahor, and Haran. It's interesting that Haran is both the name of a town, a city, but also the name of one of Terah's sons. Was one named after the other? That could well be. But Haran has several children. He has Milcah, who marries Nahor. He also has Iscah and Lot. Lot is going to be significant to us because after Haran dies, then Lot is, we could say perhaps he's overseen or maybe even semi-adopted by Abram, as Abram is going to come now into the promised land. From Haran we come down to Canaan. Let's blow up our map. Abram took Sarai his wife and Lot his nephew and all their possessions which they had accumulated and the persons which they had acquired in Haran. They had been there for some time. And they set out for the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan. And Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem. Now Shechem's an ancient city. It will in New Testament days be called Sychar. That's the place where Jesus is going to meet a Samaritan woman by the well. Here's the site of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. Now the Canaanite was then in the land. As Abram comes into the land's already fully occupied. It's not like he's coming into a new wilderness where there's nobody there. No, not at all. Canaan is occupied by Canaanites. That's why it's called the land of Canaan. They have cities all up and down this land. And Abram is coming into the land as a sojourner, a visitor. Can I call him an illegal alien coming into the land? The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. Abram's not going to get the land. It will be his descendants that are given the land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. And then he proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. These are locations that would be familiar to the Israelites once they come into the land under Joshua. And so there's not a lot of explanation. It's assumed that the readers of Moses are going to eventually find out where this is. And Abram relocates, and there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. We're going to see a pattern here of Abram. When he moves from one location to the next, he will build an altar and he will call upon the name of the Lord. And Abram continued on, journeyed on, continuing toward the Negev. Now the word Negev eventually comes by the Jews in Hebrew to refer to the direction south. That's because the Negev, the desert, was located to the south of Canaan proper. And Abram's moving in that direction, and he's not going to stop moving in that direction. He's going to take a bit of a turn toward the west until he comes to Egypt. Now there was a famine in the land. Here's what's driving him. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. Egypt, the land along the Nile, and Abram comes now to Egypt. The pyramids were already ancient monuments in Abram's day. We'll talk more about them next time, but for now, notice actually I'm standing next to the Great Pyramid, and I refer to this sort of kiddingly as the not-so-great pyramid, only because it's about 20 feet shorter. But we'll talk more about the pyramids next time. These were already old monuments. Any idea that you get of the Israelites having Israelite slaves working to build the pyramids, that's just not true. They were already here in Abram's day. Signifying a great culture that was already here, a great civilization. Egypt's early kingdom, its old kingdom, had already come and gone by the time we get to Egypt. Now, Abram comes back into the land after his sojourn in Egypt. There he has this thing of, the Pharaoh is always on the lookout for women for his harem, and he says of Sarai, she's not my wife, she's my sister, and the Lord intervenes, but eventually they come back into the land of Canaan. And it's back into the land of Canaan. Remember, this is a land that's already possessed, that's already full of people. But Abram and Lot together have a falling out because their flocks are just too much for the land to handle. After all, the land is already possessed by other people. You can't have your flocks go in and eat some neighbor's crops. So there's very limited resources, and as a result, the flocks of Abraham or of Abram and Lot are just too much for the land to sustain them, and they divide, they separate. Now that means that Lot's not going to be Abram's adopted son, and Lot goes down to the Vale of Sodom, that is the Jordan River Valley. Now, as we get to chapter 14, Abram and Lot have separated, and our scene changes back to the east from which Abram came. It looks back to the land of Shinar, which is another word for Mesopotamia. And we have the king of Shinar. We're actually given names for these kings. We have Kedorlaomer, and then the king of Elasar, that's another name for Larsa. We have the king of Elam, located to the east of Shinar. And finally we have the king of, we're told, the king of Goyim. Now the word Goyim just means nations. So we're not entirely sure which nation it is. Is this the Hittites, as shown here on the map, or is it some other group? Cannot say for certainty. But a coalition of kings come together and they invade Canaan. They are out for spoil. They are out to take whatever is not nailed down, and they march down the Jordan River Valley, and they come to the city of Sodom, and they capture it. Not only is Sodom captured, but Lot is captured as well, and taken into captivity. Abram goes out to rescue him and brings him back. We're going to see a second rescue take place later on in the book of Genesis, not by Abram, but by two angels who, some angels come and speak to Abram. You get a sense that they're from the Lord, and we actually read of the Lord speaking to them. And after that, we're going to read about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, when it speaks of the Vale of Sodom, we're told the Vale of Sodom, which is the Salt Sea. And that makes a little bit of a quandary. Is it a vale? Is it a valley? Is it a valley of salt? Or is it actually the sea? Or perhaps, I can't help but wonder, and this is rather fanciful, I don't have anything to back it up, I can't help but wonder whether this was a valley until the incident took place in which Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, and this became a big salt lake. This became a salt sea. I don't know. That, like I said, that's speculation. Maybe that's reading far more into the text than is there. But the geology of the region is quite interesting, because the Dead Sea is like no other place on the face of the earth. The Dead Sea has these great salt deposits, 5 times that of the ocean, the salt content within this location. The southern part of the Dead Sea today has completely dried up, showing that there were in ancient times a number of cities there. Most folk look to that location, the southern part of the Dead Sea, to be where Sodom and Gomorrah were originally located. We have found some cities there, but their identification is a bit tenuous. So far, we've not found anything with a big sign on it saying, this is welcome to Sodom, or something like that. So archaeologists are still looking for such evidence, and it is slow in coming. Now, in chapter 15 of Genesis, we have God entering into a covenant ceremony with Abram. And we have to talk a bit about covenant ceremonies. In a covenant ceremony, what you would do, you wouldn't make a covenant, you would always cut a covenant. You would take an animal, or maybe even several animals, like we have described here in Genesis 15, and you would kill them, and then you would cut them into 2 parts. You would actually separate the parts of the animal, and then after you'd done this, those who were entering into the covenant would pass between the pieces of the covenant. You would actually walk between the pieces of the animal. And in doing so, what you were saying is, I promise to keep my word, and if I don't keep my word, if I break any portion of this covenant, may what had happened to this animal now happen to me. So what you were doing, a covenant was a relationship, it contained promises, but it also contained a curse, and you were putting a curse on yourself, so that you would be cursed if you did not fulfill the terms of the covenant. In Genesis 15, God enters into a covenant with Abram, and he does so not by both of them passing between the pieces of the animal, but instead we read that God passed through the pieces of the animal. Genesis chapter 15, verse 17, it came about when the sun had set that it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch, which passed between these pieces. Now the question is, why does Genesis describe the presence of God as a smoking oven and a flaming torch? Could have just said, and the presence of God, or God moved between the pieces, but instead he is described here only in terms of a smoking oven and a burning torch. I think the reason is seen when we remember to whom the book of Genesis was addressed. This is written to the Israelites who have recently come out of Egypt, and now they're in Sinai, and now they're gathered around a tent. And now that tent, whether if it's daytime, it has a smoking oven above it, a pillar of smoke. And if it's nighttime, it has a flaming torch, that which represents fire. And this represents the presence of God, a smoking oven, a flaming torch. And Moses describes in Genesis chapter 15 the presence of God entering into a covenant in such a way that the Israelites cannot help but look outside their tent and see God manifesting himself in that exact same way so many hundreds of years later. Genesis 15:18, on that day the Lord made a covenant. Actually, he cut a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, the Canaanite and the Kenizzite and the Cadmonite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Rephaim and the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Girgashite and the Jebusite. These are all the people that are in the land. And God says, I'm going to give you the land from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. The land that God promises to Abram is exactly the same land, the same description that Solomon receives in his kingship. He takes a portion of land from the river of Egypt all the way to the great river, the river Euphrates, and he exercises dominion over all of that territory. Now, coming back to Abram, we have Operation Ishmael, because Abram still does not have a son, and so Sarai takes her handmaiden and gives her handmaiden to Abram that he might have a child by her. Now, what they're doing is not something that's out of the ordinary. This was part of the culture of the day. In fact, we've discovered an ancient city called Nuzi in northern Mesopotamia, and certain tablets that were there, and they indicate some of the laws that were in force. And among the laws, not just a custom, but an actual law that was in force in that day, was that if a woman could not bear sons, she was required to obtain for her husband an alternate, somebody else who would be able to bear a legal heir. And so what Sarai is doing, she's bowing to the law and the practice of that day by having Hagar be Abram's one through whom he will have a child. And so comes Ishmael. Ishmael is technically his firstborn. However, God doesn't stop there. God eventually comes and says to Abram, I'm going to give you a son not just to you, but a son through Sarai, your wife. And she's not so sure that's going to take place. She has a little chuckle about that, because after all, she's both barren, and she's past the age where even if she wasn't barren, where she would be reasonably expected to have children. She laughs, but God has the last laugh, and the child indeed is named Yitzhak, which means laughter. That is not the only significant name change that we have. Abram also in Genesis chapter 17 has his name changed. His former name Avram, remember you've probably heard the term Abba is father, and Ram is a high place or something that's lifted up. So Avram is the father of the high place, or the exalted father, I suppose you could also say. And his name is changed to Abraham, and it's a play on words because the word Abraham rhymes with the phrase that we see in Genesis 17, verse 5, where God says, I will make you the father of a nation, the Ab-ha-mon. And you say, well, Abraham doesn't really sound a whole lot like Ab-ahom, but if you say it fast enough, it does sound alike. So it's a little bit of a rhyming play on words that's taking place here. I want to talk a bit about doors in antiquity. This is a bit off topic, but I think we need to place it somewhere. Archaeologists have noted the difference in doors, that when they looked in in Canaan during the Middle Bronze Age, that is from 2200 to around 1600, there were strong, sturdy wooden doors that could be shut and sealed and locked. By the time we get to the early Iron II, that is from 800 to 600 BC, we will see doorways of archways and with maybe curtains that are hung up, but nothing that is strong and substantial. You see, in the Middle Bronze Age, there was no strong centralized government. Everybody needed their door to stop out attackers or invaders or whoever might come along. Doors were very important. By the time we get to early Iron II, that is from 800 to 600 BC, the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah will provide a strong centralized government so that such locked doors, they just won't be a necessity. Perhaps you've heard it said that there were places back only maybe 50 to 80 years ago where people would not even bother to lock their doors. That's not so much the case anymore because things have changed. Likewise, we have that set of similarity and dissimilarity between the Middle Bronze Age, that is the age of the Patriarchs, and the early Iron Age, both early Iron and early Iron II, the days of the kings. Now, we read in Genesis about Abraham purchasing a tomb. This takes place after Sarai, I'll call her Sarah now because her name has changed by this time. After Sarah had died, he goes to some of the local inhabitants and he asks to buy a parcel of land upon which he can bury his beloved wife. And he pays for that property 400 shekels of silver. It's interesting that they actually they offer to give it to him first, and he won't have that. He says, "No, I need to purchase it." So then, if my understanding of the cost of living and the cost of wages is understandable, is correct, they overcharge him by quite an exorbitant amount. Remember that Joseph was sold as a slave for 30 shekels, or 30 pieces of silver. A shekel was not a coin. A shekel was a weight. It could be a weight of silver or it could be a weight of gold, but it was a weight, and that became the standard for money until coins would eventually be developed around 800 BC. Now, something that takes place a bit later is the Sea Peoples. In 1200 BC, now this is going to be after Abram's day, the Sea Peoples tried to invade Egypt. We're not sure exactly where they came from, but they are referred to in Egyptian writings as the Sea People. And we have archaeological evidence that indicates that these people came from some of the both Aegean islands and other islands in the Mediterranean. They attempted to invade Egypt. They were driven out. We'll see how that takes place in a few weeks when we get to Egypt. And instead, they were allowed to settle in southwestern Canaan. Let's zoom in on that. They were allowed to settle on the shores of southwestern Canaan, and these become the Philistines. The Peliset, they would have said, but we'll use the Hebrew term, the Peliset, and we're going to just continue to refer to them as the Philistines. The Philistines culturally they had a high level of culture. They had the secret of smelting iron. The Israelites didn't have that yet. It was a closely guarded monopoly. Now, coming back to Abram, he has interaction with a group I'm going to suggest are pre-Philistine. The Bible doesn't make that distinction, just speaks of the Philistines. I think they're pre-Philistine, and I think what's happening here, there are already settlements where the later Philistines will be allowed to come and join and settle in. but already there are settlements of sea peoples. Now, in the Isaac story, Abram sends his servant to go find a wife for Isaac. And his servant goes back up to Haran, and there meets the, I guess you could call it, second cousin of Abram. Bethuel, actually he doesn't meet Bethuel, by this time it's Laban. Bethuel, I'm assuming, is gone out of the picture by now. But we have Rebekah, who will come back and marry Isaac. So that will keep this line. With Isaac and Rebekah, we have twin children, Jacob and Esau. Esau being the older one, and Jacob being the younger, but actually separated only by a few minutes. When they are born, it is interesting that Jacob is holding on to the heel of Esau. And there's a play on words that we actually have a figure of speech that we use today. We say, he's pulling my leg. They had a similar figure of speech back then. When we say it, we mean he's pulling your leg, he's trying to trick you, to deceive you, to pull a joke on you. When you could heal somebody back then, not healing like they're sick and you heal them of a disease, but with your heel, and I'm turning that into a verb, if you did the heel to them, you were actually deceiving and cheating them. And so Jacob, because he's holding on to his brother's heel as they are born, his little baby hand is holding on to the little baby foot of Esau, they call him Jacob, that is, heel. And the figurative meaning behind that is he's a cheat and a con artist. Now, Jacob eventually has one too many run-ins with Esau, and he's forced to leave home. And Jacob goes back to Haran, and there he meets the daughters of his uncle Laban, and it's Rachel and Leah. And he sees Rachel, and his heart just goes pitter-patter. He falls immediately in love because she is beautiful. Leah, we're told in the biblical passage, that her eyes are weak. Does that mean that she doesn't see very well? Maybe she's cross-eyed, or does it mean that she's a little bit of an eyesore? Your eyes hurt if you look at her. Whatever it means that she's not as good-looking as her sister. And somebody said one time that most girls would rather have beauty than brains because most guys can see better than they can think. That is Jacob's predicament. He falls head over heels in love with Rachel because she looks good. He does not notice Leah's spiritual qualities because she's just not as pretty. But Laban tricks him. Laban deceives him. Can I say it this way? Jacob. And on the wedding night, and remember the wedding night, they didn't stand before an altar and exchange vows like we do today. That all took place in the arrangement, we would call it the engagement, the betrothal. And instead, they come together, Jacob and what he thinks is his intended, and the next morning, they don't have electric lights, but the next morning when the sun comes up, he looks over at her, and it's not Rachel at all. It is Leah who he has married. And he goes back to Laban and complains, and Laban says, well, you can also have Rachel, but you're going to work another 7 years. He had to work 7 years for the wife that he didn't want, and then another 7 years for the wife that he did. And then after that, he works another 7 years after that. So 7, 7, and 7, a total of 21 years working for Laban. And eventually they do have their falling out, and he returns to the land, but he returns to the land. Jacob returns with 2 wives, Rachel and Leah, and with a whole host of children. He's got 11 children by now. By Rachel, by Leah. Well, Rachel was barren, so not initially by Rachel, but she eventually did have a child. And in the meantime, they had done the same thing that Sarah had done with giving a handmaiden, and each wife had done that. So he has children by both wives as well as by a couple of handmaidens, and he comes back into the land. When Jacob comes back into the land, he hears that his brother Esau is coming to meet him. you might think, well, that's nice. My brother's coming to meet me. He's coming to meet him with 400 armed men. And when Jacob had left, Esau had been saying, I'm going to get you. I'm going to get you. I'm going to get you. By the banks of the Jabbok River, Jacob has an encounter that gives the name to the river. The word Jabbok means to wrestle, and it is here that Jacob wrestles with the angel. He has an encounter. I think it's really an encounter in some way, shape, or form with God, with God's messenger. And at the end of this wrestling match, and it's a long affair that takes place throughout the entire night, but at the end of that time, Jacob is continuing to hold on, whatever he can do just to hold on to the angel, and he's asking for a blessing, as he had asked for, as he had tried to get from his father so many years earlier. And the angel blesses him, and then the angel changes his name, says, you will no longer be called Jacob, but now you will be called Israel, because you have striven with God. That is, you have Isra'd with El. That's what the word Israel means, God's striver, because you have striven with God and have prevailed. Here we are by the Jabbok River. Now, if you go there today, they've got a big dam over it to use the water for irrigation. That wasn't there in Abram's day. It was easily fordable. But this was where Jacob had his encounter with God. And after that, meeting Esau was no big deal. Once you've had an encounter with God, any other problems just fade to insignificance. Now we turn to the Joseph story. In Joseph's case, he was the second to the youngest of all of Jacob's sons, but because he was the firstborn son of Rachel, remember Rachel had been the most beloved of Jacob, and so Joseph becomes his favorite, and his older brothers hate him for it, and eventually they resent not only him, but their father had given him a special coat, a coat signifying leadership. Some translations have it as a coat of many colors, a multicolored coat. Other translations have it as a coat with sleeves. I'm not sure which one it was. Maybe it was both. It's interesting that the Beni Hassan tomb painting located in Egypt portrays Semitic peoples coming down into Egypt, and some of them are portrayed with varied colored tunics. You can see this on the wall painting. So this was something already embedded in the culture. And in Joseph's case, his brothers take him, they plot to murder him, and then they end up selling him as a slave. And as a slave, he's taken down to Egypt, where ownership is transferred, and he becomes a slave in Egypt. Now, Egypt, I have to talk about the history of Egypt. We're going to talk more about this next time, but Egypt's history can be divided into a number of segments. First of all, there's the Archaic period, very early in its history. And if we're talking about Egypt, once they have kings, this is still in the Archaic period, but the first two dynasties would be those dynasties dealing with the very earliest period. And then we have the Old Kingdom. Now, they didn't call themselves that. We refer to that looking back. Hindsight is 20/20. And so we look at the dynasties number 3 through 6. The dates for this roughly, even though I have some exact numbers here, treat them as rough numbers. 2686 to 2181 is the Pyramid era. This is dynasties 3 through 6. These were the dynasties in which nearly all of the pyramids of Egypt are built, including the Great Pyramid, the Great Pyramids plural at Giza. Following that, things are going to go a bit south, in more ways than one, I suppose. But the kingdom of Egypt, falls apart. There's anarchy. There's confusion. We refer to that as the first intermediate period, and that's followed by the Middle Kingdom. So we have Old Kingdom and then Middle Kingdom with dynasties 11 and 12, which means that dynasties 7 through 10 take place in that intermediate period. That intermediate period, when I say dynasties, that's ruling families, and in the intermediate period, they might sometimes be ruling at the same time. But our dates now for the Middle Kingdom are 1991 to 1786 BC. And it's during this time that Abraham had come during his visit to Egypt, recorded in Genesis chapter 12. And it's also still during the time of the Middle Kingdom that Joseph is brought down to Egypt. So that's all going to take place, that's the story of Joseph taking place in the Middle Kingdom. Now, let me just finish up with our Egyptian history. Like I said, we'll repeat this again next time, but that's going to be followed by a second intermediate period in which Egypt will be actually invaded by an outside group. Now, it might not come in the form of an immediate invasion or a gradual migration, but outsiders, a Semitic group actually, known to us as the Hyksos, are going to take over Egypt, and they're going to rule Egypt for about 150 years. And then after that, the Hyksos will be driven out, and we're going to enter the New Kingdom period. That is the area where we're going to see the Exodus take place. This is dynasties 18 through 20, but we'll talk more about that and the third intermediate period that follows after that. We'll talk more about those things next time. In the meantime, we have Joseph. He's brought down to Egypt, and he's sold into the household of Potiphar, and he actually rises to prominence within Potiphar's household as the chief steward of Potiphar until Potiphar's wife seeks to seduce him, and he rebuffs her, and so having been scorned in such a way, she lies and accuses him of attempted rape, and he is taken now and thrown into prison. And it's while he's a slave in prison, that's about as low as you can go, he comes into contact with two royal officials from the Pharaoh's court, the butler and the baker of Pharaoh, and he interprets their dreams. Now, the idea of dream interpretation in Egypt was a well-established cultural way of thinking. They didn't think of dreams merely as an overactive imagination. They thought that dreams were there to tell you about reality, about life after death, about life in life, that dreams meant something. And to do that, they actually had given in scrolls what you could call a scroll or a book of dreams. And so you would say, well, gee, I dreamed such and such, and I look it up in my book, and if I dream about this, here's what that means. And all of these interpretations were already prefabbed, pre-structured, pre-given. And I suppose that worked okay until one day, and this is years after Joseph had interacted with the officials of Pharaoh. He had told the butler that his dream meant that he would be restored, and he had told the baker that his dream meant that he would be removed from the earth, his head would be removed from his shoulders. And those dreams were fulfilled. Joseph said to the butler on his way out, hey, can you just remember me and put in a good word for me? And of course the butler forgot. And several more years passed until the Pharaoh had a dream. And apparently it was a dream that wasn't covered in the book of dreams. In other words, nobody could interpret it. And this gave the butler rise to remember his previous contact with Joseph. And so through that, Joseph is brought out of prison. Joseph interprets the Pharaoh's dream, which turns out to be prophetic, that there had been 7 good years, and they were in the middle of those good years now, 7 good years in Egypt where there would be plenty to eat, and jobs were wonderful, and things were great, and they would be followed by 7 years of famine. And Joseph not only predicts it, he gives a plan by which they can deal with that. And the Pharaoh is so impressed, the Pharaoh gives Joseph his freedom, and then makes Joseph the number 2 man in all of Egypt. And Joseph's policy preserves Egypt in the days of the famine by saving up and storing for those bad years. He saves Egypt, and not only Egypt, but other groups begin turning to Egypt in the midst of a world-class famine. They begin turning to Egypt for safety and for food, including the brothers of Joseph, who now by this time many years have passed, and of course Joseph is grown up and looking and acting the part of an Egyptian. And they come before Joseph. And Joseph recognizes them. And he puts them to a rather elaborate test to play out a situation where they will have the opportunity to turn their back on the favored brother. It's no longer Joseph because they think he's dead. It's now Joseph's younger brother, Benjamin, the youngest of all. And they have the opportunity to, as it were, throw Benjamin under the bus, to allow Benjamin to be betrayed, and all they have to do is nothing. And instead, they reach out to Benjamin, they offer themselves in his place, and they are showing that they have learned from the error of their ways. And Joseph finally reveals himself to them, and Joseph sets it up where all of the Israelites, the whole tribe, all of Jacob's sons remember Jacob, his other name is Israel, all of the sons of Israel come down now into Egypt. And they find safety in Egypt, and they continue to dwell here long term. Now, there's a pattern that we ought to note of Israel's purpose, the purpose that had been given from God. Israel was called to be a special people, and this had been promised to Abraham, and that promise had been passed down to Isaac and to Jacob, and now to the sons of Jacob. But the promise had been, well, the importance of that promise, in their eyes at least, had begun to slip. You see, whenever Abraham would come to a new location, he comes into the land and he builds an altar and he calls upon the name of the Lord. And he goes down to Egypt, probably shouldn't have done that, and he comes back into the land and he builds an altar and he calls upon the name of the Lord. And every time we see Abraham moving to a new place, he builds an altar and he calls upon the name of the Lord. And Isaac, we read of him doing the same thing. Jacob gets off to a bit of a slow start, goes deceives his father, runs to Haran, he's there for 21 years, he comes back. But eventually, when he gets back into the land, he builds an altar and he calls upon the name of the Lord. And we do not see any of the sons of Jacob doing that. They are beginning to forget the promise of God, and they are beginning to forget that for which God called them. They're losing their purpose. And in such, they're in danger of amalgamating into the land of the Canaanites and being nothing more than Canaanites themselves. They are lacking in their unity. In fact, they had been willing previously to sell their brother Joseph into slavery. They're more interested in just doing their own thing, and they are losing both their racial, but especially their religious purity. And it won't be long before they are worshiping the gods of Canaan, and before they have forgotten all about God and his promises. And so God takes them into a place and puts them into a land where they will be strangers in a foreign land, where they will keep their sense of purpose, where they will be forced to have unity with one another because nobody else will have anything to do with them, and where they will be forced to be racially and religiously pure. God does this to grow his nation, and then hundreds of years later, 400 years later to be exact, God will eventually give birth to that nation from its unwilling mother, from Egypt, and bring them to a new land.